Smile, Mara. The whisper came from somewhere behind her shoulder, soft enough to feel like breath, sharp enough to feel like a blade. Mara didn't turn. She stood at the edge of the lawn where the grass had been trimmed into obedience, where white chairs were lined like witnesses, where the aisle was draped in linen that fluttered as if it already knew the ending. In the distance, a stage of pale wood and pale flowers waited beneath an arch of orchids, white, perfect, expensive. The scent drifted on the warm Sonoma air, sweet and cloying, like a truth that had been dressed up for photos. Grant Whitmore was up there, center of everything, as always. His suit was a shade too crisp, his smile was a shade too practiced. He held the microphone as if it belonged in his hand the way a trophy belonged in a cabinet, something earned, something displayed. Beside him stood Sienna Crow, the bride. Her dress caught the sunlight and threw it back in glittering shards. Her eyes were bright, her lips were calm. Her fingers rested on Grant's arm like she was holding a rail on a moving train. And down below, in the rows of guests, investors, vineyard patrons, local politicians, magazine editors, friends who had once called Mara family, there was a hum of anticipation that tasted like champagne and curiosity. Because there she was, the ex-wife, the mistake from the old chapter. The woman Grant had invited with a polite envelope and an impolite intention. Mara could feel eyes on her the way you feel heat from an open oven. She could hear laughter that wasn't laughter yet, just the beginning of it, the throat clearing before cruelty. Grant looked down the aisle and found her. His gaze landed like a spotlight, and he smiled wider. Not a greeting, not a welcome, a verdict. He raised the microphone a little, as if he was about to deliver a line he'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Mara Ellison," he said, letting her name float through the speakers like it belonged to someone else. "I didn't expect you to actually come." A ripple moved through the chairs, quiet chuckles, quick glances. Mara didn't flinch because she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a man in a dark coat despite the sun. He didn't look around like a guest. He looked around like an owner, measuring distances, reading faces, counting exits. Julian Cross. He hadn't taken her hand, not for show, not for protection. He stood close enough that the air between them had weight. Grant's eyes moved to him. The smile on Grant's face hesitated, as if it had been interrupted by a thought, and then a sound. Not music, not applause. A low, rising thunder that came from beyond the vineyard hills, swelling fast, swallowing the soft chatter like the sky itself had turned on a speaker. Heads turned, programs fluttered, wine glasses trembled on the trays. The thunder thickened into something unmistakable. Jet engines. Close. Too close. The officiant blinked like he'd forgotten what page he was on. Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. The microphone caught only a thin, stunned breath. Mara watched his eyes narrow toward the horizon. A shadow slid across the lawn. And then the wind hit. Hot, sudden, violent, lifting the orchids on the arch, snapping ribbons, making the perfect scene look briefly honest. Julian finally moved. He leaned toward Mara, his voice barely louder than her heartbeat. "You invited her to watch you win," he murmured. Not to Grant, but to the air. "Now you can watch yourself lose." Mara's gaze stayed on the stage, on Grant, on Sienna, on the moment the world began to tilt. Because to understand why she could stand there, calm, straight-backed, with the scent of orchids trying and failing to suffocate her, you had to go back. Not to the beginning of their marriage, not to the first lie, but to the exact day Mara signed away her name and didn't yet know what it would cost her to get it back. Years earlier, when Whitmore Vineyards was still a dream and not an empire, the office was a kitchen table. It was a scratched wooden surface in a small rental near Santa Rosa, littered with spiral notebooks, sticky notes, invoices printed at a friend's copy shop, and the kind of cheap coffee that tasted like determination more than beans. Mara sat there in sweatpants with her hair tied up, pencil tucked behind her ear, a laptop open to a spreadsheet that had no right to be that clean. Grant paced. He always paced when he talked about the future, as if his ambition had a physical shape and needed room to move. "We'll do tastings," he said, waving a hand like he was already on a stage. "Not just any tastings, experiences. People don't buy wine, they buy the story." Mara's pencil moved without hesitation. She wrote down "story" and underlined it twice. "Your story," she said softly. Grant grinned like a boy who had been told he was special. "Our story," he corrected, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. Mara let her eyes close for half a second, because she loved him then. Not the man he would become, but the man who still believed in things. She believed in him so much that she did what believers do. She carried the weight when the dream grew heavy. She built the decks for meetings. She ran the numbers. She wrote the emails that made people say yes. She found the small vineyard plot no one wanted, because the soil was stubborn and the slope was cruel, and she said, "This is the one," because she could see what Grant couldn't yet, that struggle made better fruit. When the first bottles came out, the label had Grant's name in bold. Mara's name was nowhere. It didn't bother her then. She didn't need to be seen. She only needed to matter. And for a while, she did. They hosted their first open house under string lights and borrowed chairs. Grant wore a vest and shook hands like he was running for office. Mara poured samples and watched people's faces change after the first sip. That was her favorite part. Not the applause, not the clinking glasses. The moment a stranger tasted something she helped create and softened. It felt like proof that their work was real. Then the money started coming. Small at first, an investor with a second home, a local restaurant contract, a boutique hotel ordering cases for its wine list. Then bigger. A magazine wrote a short piece, "The Rising Star of Sonoma." The photo was Grant. Alone. Mara had been standing beside him when it was taken, but the crop had been careful. At their first major gala, she wore a black dress and sat at the end of a table while Grant worked the room like it was his kingdom. He came back flushed and thrilled, leaned down close to her ear. "They love me," he whispered. Mara smiled, because she thought he meant us. But over time, she noticed something subtle and terrifying. Grant didn't say "we" as often. And when he did, he said it like a courtesy, a habit he was slowly breaking. The shift didn't announce itself, it seeped. He started correcting her in front of others. Not harshly, never harshly. With a laugh, with a hand on her shoulder. "Oh, Mara's just being cautious," he'd say to investors. "That's why I married her." It made people smile. It made her feel small. He started asking her to stay home during certain meetings. "They want to talk numbers," he'd say. "It's boring, I'll handle it." Mara would watch him drive off and feel a quiet alarm in her chest. Soft at first, like distant thunder. Then came Sienna. She arrived the way expensive people arrive, invited by someone else, wearing confidence like perfume. It was at a fundraiser for wildfire relief, in a tented venue with polished wooden floors and catered hors d'oeuvres that looked like art. Sienna Crow wore a pale dress and carried herself like she belonged to the room more than the room belonged to itself. She approached Grant with a smile and a business card. "I'm in brand strategy," she said. "I love what you're building here. The story is almost right." Almost. Grant's eyes brightened with the hunger that always woke up in him around compliments. Mara stood beside him, holding 2 glasses of wine, and watched the way his attention snapped toward Sienna like a magnet had been turned on. Sienna glanced at Mara and offered a perfect smile. "And you are?" she asked gently, like she was asking about a chair. "Mara," Mara said. Grant put a hand on Mara's back. "My wife," he said quickly. Sienna's smile didn't change, but her eyes did something small, something that made Mara feel briefly measured. "How lucky," Sienna said, and handed Grant her card. "Call me. I have ideas." Grant did. At first, it was harmless. Sienna suggested photo shoots, press angles, the right events. She taught Grant how to speak in a way that sounded generous while actually being self-praise. Mara tried to be supportive. She told herself it was good for the business. But then Sienna started showing up more, at the estate, at meetings, at dinners. Always polished, always laughing at Grant's jokes half a beat too soon. Mara would enter a room and feel like she was walking into a conversation already mid-sentence. Grant would turn and say, "Oh, babe, Sienna was just telling me," as if Mara was always late to her own life. The first time Mara confronted him, it wasn't a fight, it was a question. "Is she just a consultant?" Mara asked one night, sitting on the edge of their bed, the vineyard wind tapping the window. Grant looked offended, like her suspicion was an insult to his greatness. "Don't start," he said. "I'm not starting," Mara said. "I'm asking." He sighed, stood up, and began undressing like the conversation was an inconvenience. "She's good at what she does," he said. "We need her." Mara watched his back. "And do you need her?" she asked quietly. Grant turned then, eyes sharp. "You're paranoid," he said. "You're insecure. That's not attractive, Mara." It was the first time he weaponized her feelings. It wouldn't be the last. By the time Whitmore Vineyards had expanded into an outdoor event destination, wedding packages, VIP tastings, influencer weekends, Mara had become part of the furniture, useful, invisible. And Grant? Grant became a man who believed the world owed him applause. And in that belief, he began to justify anything, even betrayal. The day Mara signed the divorce papers, it was raining. Not a romantic rain, not a cleansing rain. A cold, steady rain that made everything look gray and truthful. Grant chose a cafe in town, a public place, because he was careful about optics. He arrived in a tailored coat, hair perfect, expression calm. Mara arrived with wet sleeves and the heartbeat that refused to slow down. On the table between them was a folder. Grant's lawyer sat nearby, not looking at Mara, like she was paperwork too. Grant spoke like a man who had practiced compassion in the mirror. "I don't want this to be ugly," he said. Mara stared at the folder. "Then why did you make it ugly?" she asked. Grant's expression flickered, annoyance quickly covered. "I didn't," he said. "You're the one who can't accept reality." "What reality?" Mara's voice cracked. "That you cheated, that you—" Grant leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Careful," he murmured. "People can hear you." Mara glanced around and realized, with a sharp surge of humiliation, that he was right. That was his favorite kind of power, making her feel too exposed to speak. Grant slid the folder toward her. "This is fair," he said. "You get a settlement. You get to move on. You stop making scenes." Mara opened it with shaking fingers. Pages, clauses, numbers that looked generous until you understood what they didn't include. Her contribution, her stake, her identity. She flipped to a page and found something that made her breath stop. A section about intellectual property, brand materials, recipes, concepts, everything that had once lived in her notebooks, assigned to Grant, forever. Mara looked up. "That's mine," she said. "Some of this is mine." Grant smiled gently, as if she were a child misunderstanding a toy. "It's the company's," he said, "and the company is mine." Mara's throat tightened. "It was ours," she whispered. Grant's eyes hardened. "It was mine the moment you stopped being useful," he said, and then, because he knew he'd gone too far, he softened his voice again. "Just sign, Mara. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Mara stared at the pen. Her hands were cold. She realized in that moment that Grant wasn't offering peace. He was offering silence, and he was daring her to refuse. Because refusing would mean court, public hearings, friends choosing sides, the business she loved becoming a battlefield where her name would be dragged like a mop. Grant knew her. He knew she hated spectacle. He knew she feared being seen as crazy more than she feared being wronged. He used that. Mara swallowed. "What about the house?" she asked. Grant shrugged. "It's in my name," he said. "You'll find somewhere else." The words landed like stones. Mara's chest ached so sharply she thought she might vomit. And then Grant said something so small, so casual, so cruel it became the scar she would carry for years. "Think of it this way," he said. "This is your chance to disappear quietly." disappear. Like she had never been part of the story. Mara looked down at the papers again. The rain tapped the window. The cafe smelled like burnt espresso and damp coats. And Mara signed. One signature, one stroke of ink. And her life, her work, her marriage, her name became something Grant could edit. That night, Mara moved into a small apartment with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. She unpacked her belongings like she was unpacking a stranger's life. There was one thing she didn't unpack, a ring, her wedding ring. She held it in her palm for a long time, turning it, watching the dull light catch the metal. It felt heavier than it should have been, because it wasn't just jewelry, it was proof. Proof that she had believed, proof that she had built something real with someone who had decided reality was optional. She placed the ring in a small glass jar and tucked it into a kitchen cabinet behind a box of tea she never drank. Then she sat on the floor and let the silence fill her until it felt like drowning. Week passed. Months. Mara tried to rebuild. She worked small jobs, event planning, consulting, anything that kept her moving. But the town was small in the way wealthy towns are small. Everyone knows everything, and no one says it out loud. She'd walk into a cafe and feel eyes glance at her, then away. She'd hear her name said softly behind her back. Poor Mara. She couldn't keep him. He upgraded. The wound wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. It was being reduced to a cautionary tale told over wine. Then, one night, Mara attended a charity auction for wildfire recovery. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because she wanted to feel useful. The venue was quieter than the gala years ago. The crowd older. The mood serious. On display was a rare bottle of Pinot from a small, nearly forgotten vineyard. People bid for status. Mara studied it for truth. She leaned closer, reading the label, noticing a detail in the year, how the smoke would have affected the tannins, how the harvest timing would have changed everything. Without thinking, she murmured, "That bottle shouldn't be here." A voice behind her replied, calm and amused, "Why not?" Mara turned. The man standing there didn't look like the loud kind of rich. No flashy watch, no eager smile, just a stillness that made the space around him feel ordered. Julian Cross. She recognized the name the way you recognize a storm warning. Cross Holdings, Cross Aviation, Cross Foundation. A billionaire who rarely gave interviews, who appeared in headlines like a shadow, always connected to acquisitions, never to gossip. Mara held his gaze, surprised she wasn't intimidated. "Because it's been stored wrong," she said simply. "The cork is too dry. That seal won't hold much longer." Julian studied her the way Grant used to study soil, looking for value. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," Mara replied. He looked back at the bottle, then at her again. "Most people here are bidding on the label," he said. "You're bidding on reality." Mara didn't smile. Reality had been expensive lately. Julian reached into his jacket and handed her a card. No gold lettering, no unnecessary flourish, just a name and a number. "If you ever want to talk about wine," he said, "or about being erased by people who prefer stories to truth, call me." Then he walked away, leaving Mara holding a small rectangle of paper that felt strangely heavy. Not because it promised rescue, because it offered a question. What if she didn't have to disappear? The wedding invitation arrived in late spring when the vineyards were green and the air smelled like sun-warmed leaves. The envelope was thick, elegant, the kind of paper that said, "I have money and I want you to know it." Mara stood by her mailbox staring at her own name written in perfect calligraphy. Mara Ellison. Not Mrs. Whitmore, not Mara Whitmore, just Mara Ellison, her reclaimed name printed like a joke. Her stomach tightened as she opened it. Inside was a card, ivory with embossed edges. "Grant Whitmore and Sienna Crow invite you to celebrate their union." And tucked behind it, a smaller note, handwritten, the ink dark and deliberate. Mara read it once, then again, because disbelief has its own gravity. "Mara, I know it's been hard for you to accept how things turned out, but closure is important. Come to the wedding. Be there when the story ends properly. Grant. Closure. Properly. Mara's hands went cold. She could already picture it, the whispers, the smiles, the subtle cruelty of people pretending they weren't watching her to see if she'd crack. Grant didn't want closure. He wanted a final scene where he stood elevated and she stood below. He wanted to rewrite the ending in front of an audience.
Mara set the invitation on her kitchen counter like it might stain the surface. Her instinct was to throw it away, to refuse the stage. But something else rose beneath the fear, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not loud anger, not chaotic anger, the kind that forms slowly, like pressure in the earth. That night, she pulled the glass jar from the cabinet and set it on the table. The ring inside caught the overhead light, dull, tired. Mara stared at it and realized something that made her chest ache in a different way. Grant believed she was still the woman who would sign, still the woman who would shrink, still the woman who would disappear quietly. She wasn't. She picked up her phone and scrolled until she found Julian's contact. She hesitated, not because she feared him, because she feared what hope could do to her if it failed. Then she pressed call. He answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting. "Mara," he said. She swallowed. "He's getting married," she said. A pause.
Julian didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "I was invited," she added, forcing calm into her voice. "Not to celebrate, to be humiliated." Julian's voice remained steady. "Do you want to go?" he asked. Mara's gaze drifted to the ring. "I don't want to be there," she said honestly. "But I don't want him to think I'm still afraid." Julian exhaled softly. "Fear isn't the problem," he said. "Erasure is." Mara's throat tightened. "How do you stop someone from erasing you?" she asked. Julian didn't answer with comfort. He answered with strategy. "You bring proof," he said, "and you bring timing." In the weeks that followed, Mara met Julian in quiet places, an office that smelled like paper and clean air, a private tasting room where silence felt expensive. He didn't shower her with gifts. He didn't tell her she was perfect. He asked questions.
What did she build? What did she write? What did she sign? And most importantly, what did she still have? Mara returned to old emails, old notebooks, old drafts of tasting experiences she had designed, events Grant now sold as his vision. She found a digital folder labeled innocently Concepts 2018. Inside were documents with timestamps and her name in the metadata. She found proof that she had authored the brand's early pitch decks. She found an email chain where an investor praised her presentation, then later praised Grant for the exact same language. She found, buried in an old cloud backup, a voice memo. Her voice, late at night, talking through a plan for turning a struggling vineyard into a destination. Grant's voice, in the background, laughing. "Write it down," he'd said. "You're the genius." Mara listened to it once and felt her stomach twist. Then she listened again and felt something else. Clarity. Julian Leon introduced her to an attorney named Evelyn Hart, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm that felt like armor. Evelyn didn't pity Mara. She respected her. "People like Grant rely on one thing," Evelyn said, flipping through documents. "They rely on you staying quiet. Not because you don't have truth, because you don't want noise." Mara nodded. That had been her weakness. Evelyn smiled slightly. "Good news," she said. "Truth doesn't need noise. It needs delivery." They began building a case. Not a revenge fantasy, a legal structure. They discovered something worse than erasure. Grant had used assets and collateral in ways that depended on the illusion that Mara had never mattered. In old filings, there were references to foundational intellectual property. There were early documents where Mara's name should have been attached, and in one particularly damning place, a clause in a contract with a distribution partner, there was a placeholder that had never been properly updated. Original creator, M. Ellison. One letter, one name fragment, like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. Julian watched Mara read it, watched her hands tremble. Watched the old shame try to rise. "You see it?" he asked quietly. "Your name survived." Mara's eyes stung. "It survived in a typo," she whispered. Julian leaned forward slightly. "No," he said. "It survived in reality. He only survives in story." The wedding date approached. The venue, Whitmore Vineyard Estate, was already appearing in lifestyle blogs. Outdoor ceremony under orchids, live string quartet, celebrity chef, a guest list full of money. Grant wasn't just marrying Sienna, he was selling an image. And Mara realized something that made the plan click into place like a lock. If Grant wanted a stage, he had chosen the worst possible one. Because stages are public, and public means witnesses. Evelyn prepared documents, restraining orders, injunction requests, notices designed to stop a pending deal Grant had quietly arranged to announce right after the wedding. Julian arranged something else. Not because it was necessary, because it was symbolic. The private jet. Mara didn't ask for it. Julian simply said, "If they want to see you arrive like a loser, you arrive like a headline." Mara stared at him. "That feels petty," she said. Julian's gaze stayed level. "No," he said. "It's language. They speak status. We're simply speaking back." Mara swallowed. "What if it backfires?" she asked. Julian's mouth curved slightly, not a smile, not quite. "Then it won't be the jet that matters," he said. "It'll be the documents." Mara exhaled. The plan was set. She would go, not to beg, not to cry, not to reclaim a man, to reclaim a name. And Grant? Grant would learn what happens when you build your empire on the assumption that the person you hurt will stay small forever. 2 days before the wedding, Julian invited Mara to his office. Not the kind of office with loud art and desperate luxury. This place was quiet in a way that felt controlled. Glass walls, muted light, a view of the city that looked like it had been arranged. Mara sat across from him at a table that didn't shine because it didn't need to. Julian slid a folder toward her. "This is the part you don't know," he said. Mara opened it. Inside were charts, holding summaries, corporate structures that looked like a map of invisible power. She blinked, trying to orient herself. "What is this?" she asked. Julian's voice remained calm. "It's where Grant thinks his security comes from," he said. "Distribution, event contracts, partner financing." Mara's eyes moved across the page and paused. A company name caught her attention: Coastal Crest Logistics, Whitmore's primary distribution partner, the artery through which his wine reached high-end retailers and hotel chains. Julian tapped the page. "Cross Holdings now owns a controlling share," he said. Mara's pulse spiked. When?" she whispered. Julian didn't look proud. He looked inevitable. "Over the last 6 months," he said, quietly, legally. Mara stared at him. "You were doing this before the invitation?" she asked. Julian met her gaze. "I was watching him," he said, "because people who erase others usually do it in more than one place." Mara's throat tightened. "So you're not just my—" She stopped herself, the word boyfriend suddenly feeling too small for the room. Julian's expression softened a fraction. "I'm not here to own your fight," he said gently, "but I can stop him from hurting more people after you." Mara swallowed hard. Then Julian added the twist that made the air in her lungs feel thinner. "There's more," he said. Mara's eyes lifted. Julian slid one more page toward her, an upcoming announcement draft. The kind PR teams circulate before a big reveal. Whitmore Vineyards planned to announce a major partnership after the wedding, an expansion deal that would turn the estate into a national luxury brand. The draft quote from Grant was already written. "This is the beginning of our empire." Julian's finger tapped a small section at the bottom. "Ownership structure, pending final signature." Mara's brow furrowed. "What signature?" she asked. Julian didn't answer at first. He let her find it. She flipped to another document in the folder, a financial arrangement tied to a property holding, a collateral pledge. And there, in the required signature list, was something that made Mara's blood run cold. Mara Ellison, Foundational IP Claimant for Release Confirmation. Mara's voice came out thin. "I already signed everything," she whispered. Years ago, Evelyn Hart stepped into the room then, having been silent in a chair near the window. "Not everything," Evelyn said. Mara turned. Evelyn's eyes were sharp. "Grant tried to bury your existence," Evelyn continued, "but in doing so he left a loose thread, a legal acknowledgement that your contribution existed, because without it, one of his oldest contracts collapses." Mara's hands trembled. "So, he needs me," she said, stunned. Julian nodded once. "He built the stage," he said, "but he left the trap door." Mara stared down at the papers. She felt something darkly satisfying and deeply sad at the same time. Grant had wanted to erase her completely, but he'd never respected her enough to do it properly. He'd been sloppy, because he thought she'd never fight. Mara looked up, voice steadying. "What happens at the wedding?" she asked. Evelyn's mouth tightened. "We serve him," she said, "publicly, correctly, with witnesses." Mara blinked. "That will destroy it," she murmured. Julian's gaze held hers. "He invited you to be humiliated," he said. "Let him experience what it feels like to lose control of the narrative." Mara exhaled slowly. In her mind, she saw Sienna in her dress, smiling, thinking she was marrying a crown. And for the first time, Mara wondered, was Sienna truly cruel, or was she simply next? Because Grant didn't love people, he used them. Mara's anger sharpened into something cleaner, a decision. "Do it," Mara said. Julian nodded once. "Then we do it," he replied. And somewhere, far away at Whitmore Vineyard Estate, orchids were already being hung. Chairs were being arranged. A stage was being built for vows. No one knew it was also being built for a collapse. The morning of the wedding, the sky was brutally clear. No clouds, no mercy. Sunlight poured over the vineyard rows, making the leaves shine like polished green glass. Workers moved efficiently, placing floral arrangements, setting glassware, adjusting microphones. The estate smelled like fresh-cut grass, chilled white wine, and orchids. So many orchids. Grant walked the grounds with the satisfied air of a man who believed the world was finally reflecting his worth back at him. He greeted guests as they arrived, charming, warm, triumphant. Sienna floated beside him like a living accessory, her smile steady, her posture perfect. When someone complimented her dress, she laughed lightly, eyes bright. When someone complimented Grant, she squeezed his arm, possessive, proud. And when the topic drifted, as it inevitably did, toward Mara, Sienna's smile didn't falter. "Oh yes," she said, voice sweet. "Grant's ex-wife. He insisted on inviting her. He believes in closure." The word closure landed like sugar coating poison. Guests arrived in waves, luxury cars, private drivers, people who stepped out wearing outfits designed to be photographed. The ceremony space filled. A violin quartet warmed up. A photographer adjusted angles like a battlefield commander. Then, at the edge of the estate's long driveway, a car pulled in. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a dark sedan. Mara stepped out. She wore a simple dress, black, clean lines, no glitter. Her hair was down, brushed smooth. No jewelry except a thin chain at her neck. She looked like she belonged to herself. As she walked toward the ceremony, conversation rippled ahead of her like wind through grass. There she is. She actually came. Why would she come? Maybe she wants him back. Maybe she's here to cause a scene. Grant noticed her instantly. His smile sharpened, the way a predator's smile does when prey walks into the clearing voluntarily. He leaned toward Sienna, murmured something. Sienna turned and looked directly at Mara. The bride's eyes swept over her, head to toe, like an appraiser assessing a low-value item. Then Sienna smiled. A smile that said, "Thank you for coming to watch me win." An usher guided Mara toward her seat, not near the back, not hidden, right near the aisle. visible, a deliberate placement. As Mara sat, she felt the heat of attention settle on her shoulders. She forced her breathing steady. She could hear the violin soften into ceremony music. The officiant stepped up. "Welcome," he began, voice amplified. "We are gathered here today." Grant stood under the orchid arch, hands clasped, face glowing. Sienna stood beside him, veil catching the sunlight. Then Grant lifted a hand slightly. He interrupted. The officiant paused, startled. Grant turned toward the audience with the confidence of a man who believed every moment belonged to him. "Before we begin," Grant said, smiling into the microphone, "I just want to acknowledge someone special." Mara felt her stomach tighten. The crowd's attention sharpened. Grant looked down the aisle directly at her. "Mara Ellison," he said, drawing out the syllables like he was savoring them. "My first wife." A few awkward chuckles. Grant continued, voice warm. "She taught me a lot," he said. "Mostly, what I don't want in a partner." Laughter, some surprised, some uncomfortable, some delighted in the cruelty. Mara's hands clenched in her lap. Grant lifted his brows, enjoying the power. "I invited her today," he went on, "because I believe in closure, in moving on properly, in letting the past watch the future." More laughter, louder. Sienna leaned in and murmured something to Grant, then looked toward Mara, eyes bright with victory. Mara felt the old urge to shrink, to disappear, but then a sound. At first, it was so faint the guests didn't notice. A low vibration, a distant rumble. Mara lifted her chin slightly. The rumble grew fast, swallowing the laughter like a wave swallowing sandcastles. People began turning their heads, confusion spreading. The quartet faltered. The officiant paused mid-sentence. Grant's smile flickered as he looked toward the horizon. The rumble became thunder. Close. Too close. A shadow slid across the lawn, large, sharp-edged, moving too fast. Wind hit the ceremony space in a sudden rush, lifting Sienna's veil, rattling the orchid arch, sending napkins skittering across tables. Guests gasped, some grabbing their hats, their hair, their wine glasses. Then the sound peaked, jet engines roaring overhead, low enough to feel in bone. It passed. The roar receded. Silence hit like a slap. People stared at one another, blinking. Grant looked furious, as if the sky had insulted him personally. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, a voice came from the aisle behind Mara. Calm, controlled. "Apologies," the voice said, mild as if addressing a minor inconvenience. "Landing schedules can be unforgiving." The crowd turned. Julian Cross walked into view. He wasn't dressed like a guest trying to impress the room. He was dressed like a man who owned rooms and didn't need to prove it. Behind him, Evelyn Hart stepped forward, carrying a slim portfolio. Two other individuals flanked her, professional, quiet, purposeful. Process servers. Grant's face tightened. "What is this?" he snapped into the microphone. Julian stopped near Mara's row. He glanced down at her, not to check if she was okay, not to reassure her, but to align with her, like they were about to deliver something together. Then he looked up at Grant. His voice carried without needing the microphone. "Grant Whitmore," Julian said, calm. "I'm Julian Cross." A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. People who knew money knew that name. Grant's expression stuttered into something like disbelief. Julian continued, still calm. "You invited Mara here for closure," he said. "How thoughtful." Grant's jaw clenched. "Who are you two?" Grant began. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice clean and legal. "Grant Whitmore," she said. "You are hereby served with notice of an injunction request and a temporary restraining order related to the pending partnership and the improper assignment of foundational intellectual property." The words landed like ice. The crowd went quiet, not because they understood every term, but because they understood the tone. This wasn't drama. This was danger. Grant's face flushed. "You can't do this here," he said, voice rising. "This is a private event." Evelyn didn't blink. "It's public enough for witnesses," she said. Sienna's smile finally faltered. "Grant," she whispered sharply, "what is this?" Grant ignored her. He stared at Mara, eyes narrowed, fury boiling. "You planned this," he hissed. Mara stood, slowly, not dramatic, just deliberate. She looked at Grant and felt something inside her settle into place, like a bone that had been out of joint finally clicking back. "You planned mine first," she said softly. Grant scoffed, voice loud enough for the crowd. "You're doing this because you're bitter," he spat, "because you can't move on." Mara's gaze didn't waver. "I moved on," she said. "You just never noticed because you were busy rewriting history." Julian lifted a hand slightly. One of his assistants tapped a tablet. The large screen behind the stage, meant to show a romantic montage, flickered. For a second, guests expected photos. Instead, a simple slide appeared. A timeline, dates, documents. Not a barrage, just enough to make the point. A page with a header, Original Concepts, M. Ellison, time-stamped. A screenshot of an email. Mara's tasting experience plan is genius. A scan of a notebook page with Mara's handwriting, then one line highlighted in a contract. Original creator, M. Ellison. A murmur spread through the crowd, different now, not amused, curious, alarmed. Grant lunged toward the screen like he could erase it with his hands. "Turn that off," he barked. Julian's voice cut through, quiet but sharp. "Don't," Julian said. Grant froze, not because Julian shouted, but because Julian didn't need to. Grant turned toward Julian, voice shaking with rage. "This is extortion," he snapped. Julian's expression didn't change. "This is accounting," he replied. Sienna stepped forward, dress catching on the stage edge. She grabbed Grant's arm. "Tell me what this is," she demanded, voice tight. "Tell me now." Grant jerked his arm away. "Not now," he snapped. Sienna's face went pale. Guests began whispering openly. Some stood, phones in hand, pretending to check messages while actually recording. A man in an expensive suit, an investor, leaned toward another and murmured, "If Cross is involved, Whitmore's done." Grant heard it. He flinched, just slightly. Mara stepped forward another pace. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding," she said, voice steady. "You did that when you decided humiliation was entertainment." Grant laughed harshly. "Oh, please," he said into the microphone. "Look at you, showing up with, what, a bodyguard with a bank account?" Julian's gaze narrowed a fraction. Mara didn't look at Julian. She looked at Grant. "And you," she said softly, "showed up with a stage and thought that made you a king." Grant's eyes burned. "You signed," he spat. "You signed everything away." Evelyn lifted her portfolio. "You signed under an agreement that did not disclose material facts," Evelyn said. "And you cannot assign what you did not solely own. Not legally, not anymore." Grant's throat worked. "You're lying," he snapped. Mara's voice lowered. "I used to think the worst thing you did was cheat," she said, "but that wasn't it." Grant glared. "The worst thing," Mara continued, "was making me believe I didn't matter." Silence. Even the birds seemed to pause. Mara looked out at the guests, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had watched, the ones who had stayed quiet while she was erased. "I mattered," she said, not loud, but clear. "And the proof is right there." Julian stepped forward now, voice measured. "Grant," he said, "your pending deal requires release confirmation from Mara Ellison as a foundational claimant. You don't have it." Grant's face contorted. "You bought my partner to trap me," he spat. Julian nodded slightly. "Yes," he said simply, "because you trap people for sport." Sienna's breath hitched. She looked at Grant like she was seeing him for the first time. "Is it true?" she whispered, voice breaking. Did you build this on her work?" Grant's eyes flicked to her, then away. "Don't be dramatic," he said. Sienna's mouth opened, then closed. Her hand went to her chest, fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress like she needed something solid. The officiant stood frozen, microphone in hand, forgotten. The violin quartet sat with bows hovering. A waiter stood holding a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles still rising. And then, one by one, people started leaving. Not in chaos, in calculation. A couple of investors slipped out first, murmuring apologies. A magazine editor followed, already texting. A hotel executive shook his head and walked away without even looking at Grant. The stage that had been built for applause began to empty. Grant's voice rose, desperation breaking through arrogance. "Stop!" he barked. "This is my wedding." No one listened. Because in rooms full of powerful people, loyalty is thin, and fear is loud. Grant turned back toward Mara, eyes wild. "You're doing this to punish me," he hissed. Mara's expression softened, not with forgiveness, but with something sad. "No," she said quietly, "I'm doing this to stop you." Grant's lips curled. "You think you're a hero now," he sneered. "Showing up with a billionaire and a lawyer? Is that who you are?" Mara stared at him. She thought of the kitchen table, the notebooks, the coffee, the way she used to believe in him. Then she answered, voice steady. "This is who I am," she said. "The person who built something and refused to be buried under your story." Julian stepped beside her, not in front, beside. Evelyn handed Grant the served documents. Grant slapped them away. They fluttered to the grass like fallen petals. Evelyn didn't react. She simply said, louder now, for witnesses to hear, "Service is complete." Grant stared at the papers on the ground like they were insects. Sienna looked down at them too. Her hands trembled. She bent, picked up a page, read a line, and her face drained of color. "Grant," she whispered, This says—" Grant snapped, "Stop reading that." Sienna's eyes lifted, wet with anger now. "You lied to me," she said. Grant's jaw clenched. "It's complicated," he said. Sienna laughed, one sharp, broken sound. "No," she said. "It's simple. You did to her what you were going to do to me." Grant lunged toward her, voice low and vicious. "Don't you dare make this about you," he hissed. Sienna stepped back as if he'd struck her, and in that movement, the illusion shattered. Guests watched it happen. The bride stepping away, the groom reaching for control, the ex-wife standing calm, the billionaire watching, unmoved. The sky overhead still clean, still cruel. Mara inhaled. The orchids smelled less sweet now, more like rot. She turned slightly toward Julian. "It's done," she whispered. Julian's gaze stayed on Grant. "Not yet," he replied softly. Because the wedding wasn't just collapsing socially, it was collapsing structurally. Julian nodded at an assistant. A phone buzzed. A message flashed on Julian's screen. He looked at it once, then spoke, voice clear. "The board meeting concluded," he said. "Grant Whitmore, effective immediately. You are removed as CEO of Whitmore Hospitality Ventures." Grant's face went blank, then red, then blank again, like his mind couldn't process losing a title in public. "That's impossible," Grant choked out. Julian's voice stayed even. "You used company resources to support personal PR ventures," Julian said, "including this event. That violates policy. The board voted." Grant's mouth opened, then closed. The microphone caught the sound of his breathing, ragged, shocked. Mara watched the moment Grant realized something terrifying. His control had been an illusion, and now the audience had seen behind the curtain. Grant's eyes darted to the crowd, searching for support, for allies, for someone to rescue his dignity. But powerful people don't rescue sinking ships. They step away so they don't get wet. Grant's shoulders tightened. He looked at Mara with pure hatred. "You think you won," he hissed. Mara met his gaze. "I think I stopped losing," she said quietly. And for the first time in years, she felt no need to explain herself. She turned, walked down the aisle, not running, not triumphantly, just leaving. Julian fell into step beside her. Behind them, the orchids trembled in the breeze. The stage stood empty, the wedding music never resumed, and Grant Whitmore, once the star of his own story, stood under an arch of white flowers like a man trapped in a photograph he couldn't escape. A week later, the courthouse smelled like sanitizer and old paper. No orchids, no wine, no applause, just fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of consequence. Mara sat beside Evelyn Hart in a hallway outside a courtroom. Her hands were steady now, not because she wasn't nervous, because she had crossed a line inside herself. She was done begging to be believed. Julian sat a few seats away, not looming, not interfering, simply present. He read a document calmly, as if this was just another meeting. Grant arrived late, wearing a suit that looked less confident than it used to. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched as he saw Mara. He didn't speak to her. He spoke to Evelyn, voice low, angry. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're making me a villain." Evelyn didn't look up. "You made yourself one," she replied. Inside the courtroom, the judge didn't care about Grant's charisma. She cared about paper. Evidence, truth. Mara watched as Evelyn presented the timeline, timestamps, authorship, the buried clause, the pending deal that required Mara's release. Grant's attorney tried to argue, tried to frame it as bitterness, tried to make Mara look emotional, unstable, vengeful. The judge's eyes remained unimpressed. When Mara was asked to speak, she stood. The room was quiet. She didn't deliver a speech. She didn't cry. She said what mattered. "I didn't ask to be part of his story," Mara said. "I was part of the work, and he erased me because it was convenient." She paused, then added softly, "I won't be convenient anymore." The judge ruled on the temporary injunction, not a dramatic gavel slam, just a clear decision. Proceedings would continue. Assets and agreements tied to the contested IP would be paused. Grant's pending expansion announcement, the one he'd planned to unveil with wedding photos, was dead. Outside, reporters waited like vultures. Grant tried to slip past them with his head down, but the story had escaped his control. And the headline wasn't about romance. It was about ownership, about deception, about the ex-wife who showed up and refused to vanish. Sienna Crow never appeared in court, but Mara heard, through the quiet channels of wealthy towns, that Sienna had left the estate the day after the wedding and checked into a hotel in San Francisco alone. People whispered she'd been seen without her ring, walking fast, face pale. Some said she was planning to sue Grant. Some said she was simply trying to survive the shame of realizing she'd married a mask. Mara didn't celebrate Sienna's pain. She understood it too well. Because the worst part wasn't being betrayed. It was discovering you had been used as decoration in someone else's performance. Weeks passed, then months. The legal fight continued. Paperwork, negotiations, closed-door meetings. Mara didn't become a tabloid hero. She didn't do interviews. She focused on what she had always been good at, building, quietly, truthfully. Eventually, a settlement came, structured, careful. Mara received recognition for her foundational role, a stake, royalties tied to the brand concepts she created, and something that mattered more than money, her name reattached to the history. Not in a public apology, Grant would never offer that, but in documents that would outlive him. On a cold morning in early autumn, Mara returned to a smaller vineyard outside Sonoma, one she'd begun consulting for, independent of Whitmore's shadow. The air smelled like earth and grapes and distant smoke from someone's fireplace. She walked through rows of vines, fingers brushing leaves. She stopped near a newly planted section and knelt, pressing her palm to the soil. Her phone buzzed, a message from Julian. "Meeting ended. Good news, your claim is secured." Mara stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "For standing beside me, not in front." Julian replied quickly, as if he'd been waiting, always beside. Mara slipped the phone into her pocket and stood, letting the wind move through her hair. She thought about the wedding day, the orchids, the laughter, the jet engines, not as a fantasy of revenge, but as a turning point, a line drawn. A moment where she stopped asking permission to exist. That night, back in her apartment, she opened the kitchen cabinet and pulled out the glass jar. The ring sat inside, still. She held the jar up to the light. The metal looked smaller than she remembered, less powerful. She unscrewed the lid and poured the ring into her palm. For a moment, she felt the weight of her younger self, the woman at the kitchen table, writing story and believing love meant sacrifice. Mara walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights made the world look softly golden. She opened her hand. Then she didn't throw the ring away dramatically. She didn't smash it. She simply set it down on the windowsill. Not as a trophy, not as a wound. As a reminder. A reminder that she could survive being wrong about someone and still be right about herself. Mara turned away from the window and exhaled. The silence in the room didn't feel like drowning anymore. It felt like space. Space to build a life that didn't require shrinking. Space to love without disappearing. Space